global trade were to stop tomorrow, it would not be because the oceans are too vast. It would be because a few narrow passages failed. More than 90% of global trade moves by sea. This is not an estimate. It is one of the most stable facts in the global economy. Energy, food, industrial components, and nearly everything that sustains modern life travels across the oceans before it reaches land. Yet this immense system does not depend on the open sea. It depends on bottlenecks. A small number of narrow maritime corridors through which an outsized share of global trade must pass. These corridors are known as maritime chokepoints. Among the most critical are the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Panama Canal. At any given moment, trillions of dollars worth of goods are moving through these passages. They make global trade fast, they make it efficient, and they make it vulnerable. Modern globalization rests on three assumptions: that sea lanes remain open, that transit times remain predictable, and that disruptions are short, localized, and rare. When these assumptions hold, global trade appears stable and almost invisible. When they fail, the effects propagate across the entire world economy. Factories slow or stop. Energy prices surge. Supply chains fracture far from the point of disruption. Importantly, global trade does not usually collapse because of wars between great powers. It collapses when narrow passages fail, because the narrower the passage, the greater the leverage it creates. For decades, the world accepted this concentration of risk as the cost of efficiency. But today, that trade-off is being quietly re-examined, not by markets reacting to short-term shocks, but by states planning for a far more uncertain future. For decades, the global trading system has relied on a small number of critical maritime choke points. Among them, none illustrate structural vulnerability more clearly than the Suez Canal and the Strait of Malacca. These routes are efficient, but efficiency is not the same as resilience. The Suez Canal connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. It carries roughly 12% of global trade by volume. It is the shortest maritime link between Asia and Europe, and it is a single point of failure. In March 2021, that vulnerability became visible to the entire world. A single container ship, the Ever Given, ran aground in the canal. For 6 days, traffic through Suez was completely blocked. Hundreds of ships were forced to wait or reroute around the Cape of Good Hope. Global supply chains were disrupted far beyond the Middle East. The economic impact was measured in tens of billions of dollars. The Ever Given incident was not a geopolitical crisis. It was a technical accident, and that is precisely why it mattered. It demonstrated how fragile a critical artery of global trade truly is. The Strait of Malacca presents a different but equally serious vulnerability. Located between Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore, it is the primary maritime corridor connecting the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. Roughly 1/4 of global trade passes through this strait. More importantly, it carries the majority of energy imports for China, Japan, and South Korea. Oil, liquefied natural gas, and industrial inputs vital to East Asian economies move through a passage that is, at its narrowest point, less than 3 kilometers wide. This creates what strategists have long called the Malacca Dilemma. The economies of East Asia depend on a route they do not control, a route that is vulnerable to blockade, a route exposed to great power naval pressure, and a route operating in a region of persistent geopolitical tension. From a strategic perspective, this is not simply a shipping issue. It is a question of leverage. China, Japan, South Korea, and much of Europe depend on maritime choke points that lie far from their own territory. By contrast, the United States maintains significant naval influence over most of the world's major sea lanes. This imbalance shapes how major powers think about risk. The problem, therefore, is not congestion. The problem is dependence. And as long as global trade remains concentrated in a few narrow and vulnerable passages, that dependence will continue to shape geopolitical strategy. For great powers, dependence is not merely an economic concern. It is a strategic liability. History shows that states rarely wait for crises before attempting to reduce their exposure to structural risk. They prepare alternatives in advance. Because once a choke point becomes contested, it is already too late to build another route. Strategic planning and logistics does not operate on annual cycles. It operates on timelines measured in decades. Ports, canals, shipping fleets, and supporting infrastructure require long-term investment and political stability. This is why major powers think in horizons of 30 to 50 years. Redundancy in this context is not inefficiency. Redundancy is power. It provides options when established systems come under pressure. It limits the leverage of rivals. And it allows states to absorb shocks without losing control over trade and supply chains. This logic is not new. In the 19th century, canals reshaped global empires and commercial dominance. The Suez Canal reduced travel time between Europe and Asia and altered the balance of global trade. The Panama Canal transformed the United States into a two-ocean maritime power. In each case, changes in geography produced changes in strategy. In the 21st century, that relationship has not disappeared. But the driver is no longer engineering alone. It is climate change. As rising temperatures reshape the physical geography of the planet, routes that were once inaccessible are becoming strategically plausible. For states concerned with long-term trade security, this is not a theoretical discussion. It is a planning problem. And it is within this strategic context that the Arctic begins to matter. For most of modern history, the Arctic was not considered part of the global trading system. Sea ice made navigation unpredictable. Extreme weather made commercial shipping uneconomical. And the lack of infrastructure made sustained operations impossible. As a result, the Arctic remains strategically important for military planning, but largely irrelevant for global trade. That assumption is no longer secure. Over the past several decades, Arctic sea ice has been declining in both extent and thickness. This trend has been consistently documented by satellite observations and long-term climate records. The change has been gradual, but it has also been persistent. In shipping terms, ice-free does not mean the complete absence of ice. It refers to conditions in which ice coverage is low enough to allow commercial vessels to transit without continuous icebreaker assistance. Under these conditions, routes that were once theoretical become operationally plausible, at least during part of the year. As this shift is unfolded, 3 Arctic shipping routes have drawn increasing attention. The first is the Northern Sea Route, which runs along the Russian Arctic coast. It offers shorter transit times between Asia and Europe, but it remains heavily regulated by Russia and dependent on Russian icebreaker support. The second is the Northwest Passage, which passes through the Canadian Arctic archipelago. This route faces complex legal disputes over sovereignty and remains constrained by narrow channels and difficult navigation. The third route is different. The Transpolar Sea Route runs directly across the central Arctic Ocean. It does not follow any nation's coastline, and it lies largely beyond the territorial waters of both Russia and Canada. From a purely geographic perspective, this route offers the shortest distance between major East Asian and European ports. From a strategic perspective, it offers something even more important. It reduces dependence on traditional choke points and limits exposure to coastal state control. This does not mean the Arctic is suddenly open for global shipping. Conditions remain seasonal, weather remains volatile, and infrastructure remains limited. But the strategic threshold has shifted. The Arctic is no longer dismissed as inaccessible. It is increasingly viewed as a future option. And once a route becomes plausible, great powers begin planning around it. If the Transpolar Sea Route becomes a viable corridor for global shipping, the question is not who controls the water. The question is who supports the ships that cross it. Unlike the Northern Sea Route, which runs along the Russian Arctic coast, the Transpolar Route avoids reliance on coastal states and their ports, icebreakers, and regulations. That independence is its primary strategic appeal. But independence from coastal control does not mean independence from logistics. Long-distance Arctic shipping requires support. It requires nearby ports for refueling and maintenance. It requires search and rescue capabilities in one of the most hostile maritime environments on Earth. It requires medical evacuation, emergency repairs, and reliable communication and navigation systems. Along the Russian Arctic coast, these functions are provided by Russian infrastructure and regulated by Russian authorities. That creates dependence. The Transpolar Sea Route offers a way to reduce it, and this is where Greenland becomes critical. Greenland is the closest large landmass to the central Arctic Ocean and to the eastern approaches of the Transpolar Route. For vessels transiting directly across the Arctic, Greenland offers the most practical location for logistics support outside Russian control. Not as a single port, but as a regional platform. Airfields, harbors, search and rescue coverage, satellite and communications infrastructure. In the Arctic, these capabilities are not optional. They determine whether a route is commercially usable at all. This is a fundamentally different model of influence from what exists at places like Singapore or the Suez Canal. Singapore derives power from congestion. The Suez Canal derives power from physical constraint. They sit astride narrow passages that ships cannot avoid. Greenland does not block traffic. It enables it. Its leverage does not come from controlling a choke point, but from being one of the very few places capable of supporting sustained activity along an otherwise empty route. This is influence through indispensability, not obstruction. In this sense, Greenland is not the Arctic's version of Singapore. It is something closer to an anchor point, a place that quietly determines whether a route remains theoretical or becomes operational. This is why Greenland matters even before Arctic shipping becomes dominant. Because once vessels begin crossing the Arctic regularly, the supporting infrastructure will already define who holds influence. And in regions like the Arctic, that influence is extremely difficult to displace once established. For the United States, Greenland's strategic importance did not begin with climate change. It began with geography. During the Second World War, the United States established a military presence in Greenland to secure transatlantic supply lines and deny access to hostile powers. After the war, that presence did not disappear. It became permanent. The Thule Air Base, now known as Pituffik Space Base, has operated for decades as part of the United States missile warning and space surveillance architecture. This reflects a long-standing strategic judgment. Greenland sits along the shortest routes between North America, Europe, and the Arctic. It overlooks the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap, a critical gateway between the Arctic and the North Atlantic. For much of the Cold War, this geography mattered primarily for military reasons. In the 21st century, it matters for something more. As Arctic access expands, the United States increasingly views the region as a future corridor for trade, logistics, and influence. At the same time, Washington has become more attentive to the activities of other major powers in the Arctic. China, in particular, has identified the region as strategically relevant. Beijing has described itself as a near-Arctic state and has sought a role in Arctic research, infrastructure, and investment. These efforts are often framed as commercial or scientific. But from a U.S. strategic perspective, infrastructure in remote regions is never purely civilian. Ports, airfields, communications networks, and logistics hubs can shape access and influence for decades. This is why U.S. officials expressed concern when Chinese firms showed interest in infrastructure and mining projects in Greenland. The issue was not ownership alone. It was the possibility that early investments could translate into long-term leverage over emerging Arctic routes. From Washington's point of view, the Arctic must not become another region where critical trade routes are shaped by rivals' infrastructure. The lesson of Malacca and Suez is clear. Control does not have to be absolute to be strategically meaningful. It only has to create dependence. This is why the United States does not need to own Greenland. What it needs is to ensure that Greenland remains aligned with the U.S. and its allies, especially in a region where the first logistics platforms established may define the balance of influence for the rest of the century. Despite its strategic appeal, the Transpolar Sea Route is not a fully mature commercial corridor, at least not yet. Arctic shipping remains constrained by seasonality. For most of the year, ice conditions still limit navigation across large parts of the central Arctic Ocean. Even during summer months, weather volatility presents serious challenges. Fog, storms, and shifting ice conditions can disrupt schedules and increase operational risk. These factors translate directly into higher costs. Specialized vessels are often required. Insurance premiums remain elevated, and search and rescue capabilities, while improving, are still limited compared to established sea lanes. Infrastructure is another constraint. Unlike the Suez or Malacca routes, the Arctic lacks a dense network of ports, repair facilities, and logistics hubs. This makes sustained, high-volume traffic difficult. For now, Arctic shipping is better suited to specific cargo types and carefully planned voyages rather than continuous global flows. It is also important to be clear about what the Arctic route does not do. It does not replace existing choke points. It does not eliminate geopolitical risk, and it does not offer guaranteed reliability on the scale of traditional routes. But from a strategic perspective, replacement is not the objective. Resilience is. For states and companies alike, the value of the Arctic route lies in optionality. It provides an alternative when established routes are disrupted. It reduces overdependence on a small number of vulnerable passages, and it creates leverage by expanding the range of viable choices. In this sense, the Arctic route functions as a hedge, not against a single crisis, but against a more uncertain global environment. This is why planning for Arctic shipping continues, even as its limitations remain clear. Because in geopolitics, routes do not need to be dominant to be decisive. They only need to exist when other options fail. Greenland is often discussed in terms of territory, or resources, or military presence, but its deeper significance lies elsewhere. It lies in how geography is changing, and in how great powers respond when the physical constraints of the world begin to shift. The Arctic is not becoming important because it suddenly carries massive volumes of trade. It is becoming important because it introduces new options into a global system built on a small number of fragile routes. In that system, Greenland is not a shortcut. It is not a canal, and it is not a choke point in the traditional sense. It is an anchor, a place that enables logistics, supports navigation, and stabilizes access in a region where alternatives are scarce. For the United States and its allies, the question is not whether Arctic shipping will replace the Suez Canal or the Strait of Malacca. It will not. The question is, who will shape the rules, the infrastructure, and the balance of influence as new routes become plausible? That is why Greenland matters long before Arctic shipping becomes routine. Because in geopolitics, the future rarely belongs to those who react first. It belongs to those who prepare earliest. In the 20th century, power followed canals. In the 21st century, it may follow melting ice.